it is June 10th at 4:35 p.m. My name is Emily Figdor. I'm the chair of the policy committee, and I'm going to bring this meeting to order. We are meeting via Zoom. And should we do a quick roll? I can see, perhaps I'll just say that our Tim Atkinson is here from the committee, and I don't see Marnie. Are we expecting Marnie to join us?
I think so.
Well, she said she was available at this time. I just resent a link so that it was at the top of her inbox.
Okay, great. I will text her. We're also joined today by our chair, Roberto Rodriguez, and by member Burke, as well as the superintendent and assistant superintendent Townsend, who staffs this committee. So, Aaron, I did not see minutes. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct. I don't, I didn't think we had minutes from our most recent meeting. It was some time ago, so.
Okay. And then I think the purpose today is to really kind of catch up. We put committee work other than the finance committee on hold during the pandemic, and this is an opportunity to check in on our work and create some plans for starting to move some pieces of our work forward again. Anything else you want to add to that, Aaron?
Sorry, hang on. Marnie's texting me, so I'm trying to make sure her all of her info is correct. But I think, today was, we obviously have been on hiatus for a little while, and so wanting to, there are a couple of, important policy areas, and so we wanted to talk through our approach to be prepared for when we resume in August, to be able to engage with those and move those through, policy committee vetting and up through the board. And those, relate to the three areas, as it relates to SROs and law enforcement in general. So we'll start with that. Then the work that we had begun around sexual harassment and updating. We had a recent check-in with the subcommittee about that. And then third was, in the transition to remote learning, there are some technology-oriented policies that we'd like to take up revisions around to be prepared for whatever we might encounter next year. So those are the three areas.
Okay, terrific. So that's our agenda for today. And Aaron, I think with that, unless there's anything else, I'll hand it over to you to start us off on the conversation about SROs.
Yep. Hang on, or Javier, I don't know if you, oh no, there's Marnie. Okay, all right, good. The technical issue solved. Let's see. Hi, Marnie, welcome. So, so what we wanted to share as it related to SROs and law enforcement was, it was something, we had envisioned prior to the pandemic, doing some engagement to develop the broader policy that, was suggested as it relates to the overall MOU around the administrative regulations that kind of govern the role of SROs in the schools, and at some level, our interaction with law enforcement in general. And I think, as folks know, that was when the MOU was established, that was never, there was the intention of a policy to be implemented that codified some of that was never implemented. So, or was never fully developed and, authorized and, kind of executed as a board policy. So the intent had been to work with, some stakeholders to develop a draft first internally, but then as well consulting with external folks, looking at, and we looked at model policies from the state of Washington as well as Massachusetts to help inform, a potential draft so that we would be prepared on subject of execution, agreement to the MOU that we had moving into next year, kind of clearer understandings and agreement around roles and responsibilities and expectations and things along that sort. So we, then the pandemic hit, and so that work hasn't happened yet, but we wanted to be able to, kind of frame to you all what we would like to have happen and get feedback on kind of the parameters of that engagement that you feel like would make sense, so that we could come forward in August with a draft of that kind of proposal. And I'll acknowledge, so I'll name that and then acknowledge that we feel like there's, in addition, there are a number of other policies that implicate the role of SROs or our relationship with law enforcement that we think would make sense at this time for us to consider as well to bring forward. So our intent had been to utilize those draft model policies and the existing kind of prior draft to develop a version of an overall umbrella kind of policy as it relates to the MOU for SROs and our relationship with law enforcement. And then to be able to do, over the course of the summer, some engagement with internal stakeholders, including our school leaders, including, high school students in particular, and then, external engagement as well about that draft, getting opportunity for people to provide feedback. We've been in conversation certainly with ACLU as a partner or others. Of course, the police department would be a critical partner, in the development of that in terms of feedback, so that we would do that over the course of the summer to bring forward to you all for us to look at as, when the policy committee convenes in August. So that had been the intent, I think, over the past, 2 weeks, a recognition that that work is important regardless of the direction the board takes about the MOU with, or as it relates to SROs, that we need to do some work to kind of codify our overall relationship with law enforcement and make that clear and transparent within our school community so that staff know how to manage those relationships and those engagements. And that led us to look across our policy books to see what other policies suggest relationships with law enforcement, and to ensure in articulating the overall kind of umbrella policy that other related policies may be consistent with what we advance in kind of the overall umbrella policy. So some of those that, would have at least would need some attention, or at least vetting to see if they're consistent with what we'd articulate, include our educational records policy. It includes a policy around our security cameras, policy around drug and alcohol policy, JICH, and then some as it relates to conduct, both the code of conduct, the weapons and violence policy, as well as the bomb threat policy. All of those from an initial review that may not, I don't want to quote that that's exhaustive, but in terms of an initial review, all of those had language that spoke to expectations around our relationship with law enforcement. And so we think, at this moment, if we are going to be setting kind of an overall framework around that relationship. Oh, and I didn't, an important one that I missed was the visitor policy. Sorry, apologize. So we would intend to move forward with developing a draft of the overall policy, as well as examine each of the ones I named to ensure that they would be, the language in those would be consistent with what we would be putting forward in the overall kind of policy that supports the MOU, whether that MOU is inclusive of SROs or not moving forward. So we believe that there's the role to have some level of agreement and understanding about the relationship between our two organizations, regardless of the decision about the SROs, and that would be kind of the umbrella policy, somewhat as our code of conduct is kind of the umbrella policy as it relates to student discipline. And there's lots of policies that kind of fall, I would want to say fall under, but are connected to that and kind of get cited in the way that the code of conduct policy is framed. So that had been our, that's our intent, in terms of engagement and policy development to bring something back for this committee's consideration in the fall. And so we wanted to, A, just communicate that, B, get any feedback around expectations around engagement or any parameters around that this committee would want us to consider as we kind of embark on that work.
Thank you. I guess I'll get started and say, first on the SRO, on the need to develop an SRO policy, I would suggest that, what we have already, if we were to go down that route, I would say the draft, what we already have drafted needs a wholesale revision in terms of the framing.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, great. If we're at that same place in terms of thinking we need to kind of to start over. When we were working on the body cameras issue, I think we were trying to make some tweaks to the MOU to kind of to in particular try to more clearly define the role of the SRO, and this would give us an opportunity to wholesale be very thoughtful about the role of law enforcement in our schools and how we want to set up that framework. So I appreciate looking at the additional policies that involve law enforcement. I would say if we do go down this route, I think that myself and other board members would probably be pretty interested in being very active participants and not just, kind of reconsider. I know for myself, I wouldn't want to pick up the policy in August and, debate it and vote on it. And my guess is that would be the case for other board members as well. I am not sure the process with respect to SROs is needed. I think there might be an opportunity to just more clearly get to the heart of the issue in a faster way. But I'm certainly, if that isn't the case, I'm certainly very interested in developing a thoughtful policy about how we involve law enforcement in our schools in a way that is consistent with the Portland Promise and our goals around equity in the whole student, as well as people, all of our goals.
I had a question. I wonder if any of the policies were part of the, is it the Center for Educational Equity audit? I imagine that there's some overlap between the policies that were called out there and these ones that involve law enforcement.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Tim. There are only two of them, the Code of Conduct policy and the weapons policy, were part of the equity review. So, a thought, right, would be that, that's work that we also, was tabled in the pandemic, is work that we need to come back to, that we would, in this initial round, focus on ones that were not a part of the, that equity review, so that we did that as part of the, that package of policies, the student conduct policies that the Center for Educational Equity reviewed, so that as we move through those, the lens that we're, working from in terms of that is both the equity feedback from the Center for Educational Equity and the lens around what is the, kind of implication in terms of relationship with law enforcement and anywhere within those. So those two were the only two of that initial batch that had that crossover.
Great. The other question I had was slightly different, but I think very related topic around school discipline. And I'm wondering if there's any vision for policy, for digging into policies around our own, internal school discipline, given the data that we've seen recently. Srini, okay?
Yeah, apologies. Thank Monique. On the desk. Well, I think that is like the equity work from that review of that body of policies. Like that's that work, right? Does this reflect? And I think, we've had a variety of conversations about how do I dig into that work, right? Because of the way the feedbacks come. And I think we need to revisit that, right? To make sure we're clear. But I think that is the work of that, is taking that body of policies, the system-wide code of conduct, discipline, suspension, expulsion, weapons, bullying, and cyberbullying. I think those were the kind of like package of policies, and considering the feedback provided there and all of these issues. So that, I think, is our, a big charge of our substantive work moving forward.
And am I understanding correctly that the proposal now is to deal with the law enforcement related policies first, and then dig into the equity and school discipline related policies?
Yes, correct. Yeah, we felt like the urgency, again, I mean, certainly lots of urgencies for things, but, initially in the context of thinking about, that we, where the conversation has been about around the SRO MOU, that we haven't had the policy on the books to kind of back it up and acknowledge, Member Figdor, your point around like, yes, this is not just like tweaking the existing one, but kind of going back to utilize some of the, kind of national exemplars we've seen to reframe it. But that we wanted, if we were going to renew that MOU, we wanted to begin the year at least with traction moving towards the adoption of a policy that supported the work that was called out in that MOU. So recognize questions have now emerged about whether the relationship will continue exactly in that way. So as we're adjusting to that, we still feel like that'll be important in this moment to whether the specific MOU and relationship with SROs in our buildings continues or not. And as that conversation happens, that we want to advance, the clarity of the relationship with law enforcement. And there's a role to have a policy that articulates that we can be able to utilize to help kind of govern and inform staff about how they should act. And, what is our policy actually, right, around those things.
Yep, I think and that's a big gap in the current setup, and so I think I'm on board with this plan. I think it seems great. Thank you.
Anyone else? If not, maybe I'll clarify for the members of the public who are in attendance, at least my thinking, which is, I think there's a question now, given the focus of our community and the nation on police brutality and trauma that comes from current and the long history of violence of the police to Black communities and communities of color, whether we go forward with our agreement with the Portland Police Department with regards to SROs. And I think the full board may be looking to take this issue up. So, this conversation around the policy development is kind of on a parallel track. If we do go forward with the SROs, we absolutely need a policy to better define the role of the SRO and what is the role of our school staff in school discipline. And so we have a lot of work to do in that regard if in fact we go forward with the MOU for next year, with the memorandum of agreement for next year. So that's at least kind of just to be explicit about at least how I'm coming to this issue.
So, Marnie, have your hand.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So it's kind of hard to know exactly where to start, but I appreciate you, Aaron, laying it out in terms of a larger context. I think the SRO piece, as you have discussed it, is a larger conversation around our work with the law enforcement overall in our schools. And what I don't want to do is be quick to make any decision, honestly, because I want to make sure that we're following a very clear process and we're extremely transparent. And we are, we're making sure our stakeholders are all engaged. And when I say stakeholders, I'm thinking of our students all the way to our staff, our principals, and I think that that's exactly what you were explaining from what I understand. I personally, in light of all the tragic events that have happened and the national reaction, I personally would not feel comfortable at all in a matter of a week making a big decision about this, and I don't feel ready to do it based on our previous work just only a few months ago. Without hearing from, I know a petition is coming to us. I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen language about any other type of resolution. I, again, do not feel comfortable. We're heading into summer. I'm just concerned around leaving people behind. And we talk a lot about people who don't have a voice, but we may be doing also harm in not allowing enough time either, being reactive. So it's hard, it's very hard for me I've been doing a lot of my own personal self-reflection and a lot of working on my own, looking internally at my own biases, but I want to make sure that, again, we're looking at the whole of it all, and I appreciate you laying it out that way as well, Erin. So thank you.
Yeah. Superintendent.
I guess I have a question for Board Member Figdor. You know, I think you said that if we move forward with the MOU, that there is a lot of work that needs to be done around the role of the SRO and the policy. I think what we're suggesting is that regardless whether we move forward or not with the SRO, that work needs to happen. It will be different if there is no need to have an SRO MOU. It will be different, but the work around, you know, a policy that clarifies our engagement with the police in our schools is one that's necessary regardless, and it just changes. So right now, the policy that we had been using as the basis was the administrative guidelines that were attached to the MOU, and that says relationship with SROs and law enforcement, and it would just be for law enforcement if there were no SROs, but we would still need to do that. And not having an SRO changes significantly some of those other policies that Mr. Townsend outlined. And so that's, you know, we would need to look at all of those policies in light of the decision to move forward with SROs under this policy or with an MOU, or, you know, without an SRO, those policies would need to be revised differently.
Yeah, I hear that and appreciate that, and think this is a very good opportunity to take up those the broader issues as well. So I understand that the work still needs to happen in this committee, and I'm willing to, more than willing to jump in and help make that happen, including during the summer, if, depending on the pace of the work that Mr. Townsend wants to put us on.
Thank you.
Yeah, I see the chair has his hand up.
I guess just wanted to, for the sake of clarifying, that the policies that we're talking about obviously govern the entire district and not just the 2 schools that currently have SROs. So when we're talking about this conversation taking place on either side of a decision to keep or not the SROs, that we're still having conversations about that relationship as it affects the entire district. So again, just to bring us back to that, so that there's no nothing that signals that we're specifically talking about Deering and Portland High School.
Yeah, to that point, I think, in my first year here, have received questions from folks at middle schools and, other places around needing clarity about what are their roles and responsibilities as it relates to potential law enforcement engagements with students. And so, yes, it's in service of that kind of more holistically so that everybody has clarity in terms of guidance.
And then maybe the last thing I want to say on this is just, I think it's urgent that we take these issues on. I think we look around and see that, minute by minute. I do also think that the additional policies that were raised in the equity review also are, need our attention as quickly as possible. So I'm anxious to also get to those policies. So I know we had a lot of work to do as a committee this year, and unfortunately have had to put so much on hold during the last few months, which is understandable, but that work is still so critical. So I look forward to getting to the rest of the equity, to revising the rest, the other critical policies that that were highlighted during our equity review as well.
Yes, I concur. And yeah, was thinking about this, the importance of this check-in to make sure we were prepared around what we wanted to try and advance over the course of the summer, so that then we could be prepared to, transition into doing some of that work, that has been on our docket to do. And, remember the assertion from this committee of prioritizing that work over potentially other bodies of work around the continuing the book reviews and things like that. Those are other, to-do items on the policy committee list, but understand that the priority for the group had been, right, and certainly should continue to be the equity review as our next kind of move. But felt like the ones we're talking about tonight had a timeliness. It's all timely, but a specific kind of urgency around doing some work on them over the summer to be prepared for the start of the school year. Tim?
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering, given that work has been, delayed a bit, or is going to take us some time to pull together. I'm wondering if there's some work going on, sort of in implementation of school discipline. Like, are things changing sort of under the policy and implementation level around discipline practices at all in any ways that that can be mentioned tonight in response to the data that we saw around disparate impacts of school discipline and suspensions and such?
Javier, do you want? So yes, I think, that work is not waiting for the policy review by any means, and has been underway for some time. And I think there's, a few elements to that strategy. And I think we're, anticipating talking, helping to frame kind of clearly for the whole board, on Tuesday, to make sure there's clarity about what is, kind of our how do we articulate the scope of what our work is around equity, and in terms of, advancing Portland Public Schools as an institution that is, fighting, racist practices, inequitable outcomes. So as it relates to, school discipline, we are in, and Javier, you can fill this in for me, but, we have expanded our PBIS work in terms of deepening that across the system. We have had, Dr. Chris Reiger, as a part of that work. So that's one of the foundational moves, right? To be able to support, kind of more positive interventions, before to avoid discipline issues. That's a key piece of the strategy, as well, the expansion of the behavioral health continuum. So we're providing supports for kids who needed them, as opposed, and doing therapeutic intervention, as opposed to, kind of, punitive intervention, right, from a discipline context, and utilizing those structures. So that's certainly been in play. Of course, the equity kind of mindset work that we've been doing through the equity cohorts is a complementary piece of that. So while we're looking to change practice, there's the change in mindsets that we're trying to cultivate as well. So that's another element of that, and I think the, we have seen in some places, in an area for us to continue to grow, around, the initiation of work from a kind of a restorative place, that, is an area that there's begun some work. It hasn't, I wouldn't say, is a systemic reform effort at this point, but certainly there are examples around that we're continuing to support. So I don't know if anything else you want to say about that, Javier.
No, I mean, I think that we intend to present on our overall equity strategy at Tuesday's meeting, because we do think that, this is a moment where it's important for everybody to understand what it is that we are doing, and, the pace that we've been moving at. And, we also think that this is an opportunity to, build some momentum and energy behind that pace. I certainly, as I reflect on where we are, and as I said, at the last board meeting, I'm not proud of where we are. And so I do think that there is a need to step up that work. And, I want the board to fully understand what the work looks like and what it looks like to accelerate the pace. Because, the reason, and I know you've all seen this this article that we've used, to sort of frame some of this work, that, we've moved at a pace that is comfortable to people. And then, the outcome of having people be comfortable with the pace of change is the data that you've seen. So I do think that this is a time and an opportunity for us to step up that work. And, so I want to engage in a, conversation with the board about that.
I would also just want to acknowledge, I know I named a number of kind of like school culture oriented policies, but I think, and this will kind of be clear, in the presentation on Tuesday, but I would, advance that in service of reduce, like the academic strategies as well are also part of the overall effort to reduce discipline disparities as well as achievement disparities. So the work that we've done around Wabanaki studies and decolonizing curricula and needing to continue to advance that is not in service solely of academic outcomes, but also, we believe will manifest in reductions in disparities there. The work that we've committed to around our math program, right, and advancing that and building capacity in math and reducing it on that side, we believe as well will have, so it's not, I think it's important as we continue to frame this up that those strategies, as they get at, get at the core of the teaching and learning work that we're doing, and that relationship are also essential to changing some of those outcomes as it relates to school culture that we see in student connectedness to school, and that kind of stuff. So it's not just restorative justice as an intervention around discipline disparities, but actually ensuring that students get access to meaningful curricula that's provides the appropriate level of challenge and respect for kids, and is reflective of them and their experience, and that they can connect to. That those are strategies that will advance our goals around reducing discipline disparities. So, but we'll have kind of a summary around that on Tuesday.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Chair.
So I wanted to just, how do you say, I'm sorry, I'm trying to lower my hand, sorry. So I just wanted to bring us back to the conversation about the SROs. I appreciate the shift towards the equity work. But just as we were saying that the work that we would be taking on reviewing the policies is something that we're going to put on the agenda, or rather that it's a sure thing that it's going to be on the agenda. It's a must do. But we sort of kind of glanced over the how the board would decide whether we would continue or not the program, and given that the MOU expires at the end of the month, we were having conversations about whether the board would make a decision to terminate it this year, and these discussions, you remember began back almost a year ago, and through our work to last fall on the MOU, although the decision to terminate it or not was not the bulk of our discussions. It certainly was part of the what we were contending. And so given all that's happened over the last year, and I don't necessarily want to go into the details of it, timeline that is, I'm having conversations with board members over the last week, or the last couple of weeks rather. We felt, or rather a majority of board members did feel that they wanted to advance a motion at our next meeting where this question would be brought up at the point of decision to continue with the program or not. And so as of right now, that is something that most board members are expecting would be on our agenda for next Tuesday evening. And I still haven't, that agenda is still not finalized, so I've still not talked to the superintendent about what that looks like. But it is something that board members had conversations with me about. So having said that, I want us to just reflect on that as our immediate next steps rather, and then sort of kind of start to form the process that works around that thought. So I'll leave it at that and then see what the committee members have to say.
Marnie, Ms. Mariano.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Chair. I just want to reiterate what I was saying earlier in terms of board process and transparency, and whatever is planned for Tuesday night still should follow our board process of, if it's a vote, would have a first read and a second read. So looking at the month of June and realizing that we still will have 2 meetings in June, right?
Time we're only scheduled for the meeting next week on the 16th, and that would be our second meeting of the month. So we would always obviously have the option of calling a special meeting, on the 23rd. As you know, we are scheduled for an executive session. So we could do it, on the 23rd following the executive session, or we could do it on the 30th and still be within the month of June.
I personally believe that if we should follow, again, board process, just simply because of the timing, making sure that, again, all voices get heard before we vote. Thank you.
Do we typically have first and second read on resolutions? Because my understanding was, or thinking was, that this might come in the form of a resolution. And like when we did the solar resolution, for instance, I don't believe we had a first and second read. I think we just passed it in one meeting.
I don't think there is a prescribed, rule around that. That we often bring things that are actually action items, with a single vote. I absolutely understand Ms. Morioni's point, and I think it's somewhat, it doesn't matter if it comes in a resolution or if it's something else. I think the point is that, this is a substantial action that the board would be taking, because it would be, an action to end the MOU. And so, from that perspective, something of that magnitude, having, a more robust process as opposed to a thinner process is, I think makes sense to me.
Sure, it makes sense to me as well. I just want to, just concerned about how we can get it done, given that we don't have another scheduled meeting until August.
And again, we could schedule you could schedule a special meeting, on, June 23rd or June 30th, or, any day of the remainder of the month. And we could, so it would just require, the chair and I, meeting and discussing, having an additional meeting.
Mr. Atkinson.
Thank you, Chair. I think doing a special meeting makes sense to me. I don't know that I love the idea of having it right after an executive session, just because I think there might be a problem with optics there. Yeah, but I think that seems like the right thing to do, to give it a more full process. But at the same time, we only have till the end of this month before the MOU would renew. So there's some urgency. I mean, there's there's a wider sense of urgency, but there's also sort of the timeline of the MOU itself. So I think that would be my preferred process.
And just to be clear, the MOU as it's currently spelled out says that it renews at the beginning of the next school year. It doesn't automatically renew on July 1st. So there is not, a physical sort of provision in the MOU, but I do know that, from the city's perspective, knowing whether they need to budget for the SROs to transfer into their budget, the staff that are currently SROs to transfer into their budget and so on, but also is a consideration from their perspective. So I do think that, sooner is better than later, but if there is not there's not a requirement in the MOU that says this will renew on July 1st. So.
Thank you for clarifying that, Superintendent. I also would prefer just not to leave this hanging for a month and a half in the middle of the summer.
Agreed.
Okay, so I think where we're at, Mr. Burke.
Yeah, thank you. Just from a board member perspective outside of the committee, I'd just say that I support a transparent process that moves us through that process this month. And if that involves a special meeting, I'm in favor of that.
Okay, so it sounds like the chair and the superintendent are gonna talk about both ensuring this issue is on our agenda on Tuesday at our next meeting, and then given that a policy is gonna come before the board, that we have ample time, the community has ample time to review it and to be involved in our debate about it, and so that we would look to schedule a special meeting before the end of the month in order to address this issue and vote on the policy and whether to continue to have SROs in our schools. And then regardless of the outcome of that, we know we need to take on this broader issue of the role of law enforcement in our schools, and the policy committee will be the place where we're going to do that. And Mr. Townsend will be moving that work forward and involving the committee. I think for me, including over the summer, if there's work that I can be helpful on. And then we know for the larger issue, the larger policies around equity that we will get to those shortly after that will be the next set of policies that we are addressing, although we have others on our agenda tonight too, which are also very important and urgent. So, Mr. Townsend, anything else? All right, I see Ms. Morioni has her hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to request of the superintendent and Aaron to, if we can, since we are into the school year and heading into summer, and what helped me make my decision previously was also hearing from our principals and staff and the students. And so I know that's part of my decision making, is listening to, again, the people right in the schools. I think it's very important. We had heard from them. We had gotten quite a bit of information from them previously. Just want to ensure even that that their thoughts, or whether their thoughts have changed, or I don't know, some way to get kind of an understanding. I know it's short time frame, but when I say to bring in the stakeholders, I'm imagining you're already contemplating, that would be a part of it. So I appreciate your help with that.
Yep. They are, aware that this conversation was happening tonight, and, following along, and, can expect that they'll be present for any dialogue about this issue moving forward.
Okay, so with that, I believe we can move to our sexual harassment and subcommittee and an update on that work.
Great. So as members of the committee are aware, we had launched a sexual harassment subcommittee that had its first meeting in January and had a monthly cadence for its work, with the charge of revising our policy ACAA, which is our harassment and discrimination policy, as well as the administrative regulation that goes along with it in terms of how we handle complaints and issues. And to consider then other issues around implementation and support around that. So we were fortunate to be partnering with a number of kind of community-based organizations and advocates around the issue to help inform our work. So we had, by March, in terms of having done some work to review examples from other districts in terms of best practice, done some work in terms of hearing from student perspective around that. We had formed into subcommittees where people were beginning to take up subcommittees from the subcommittee, if you will, working groups, I believe, where people were trying to take on tackling, producing a draft, and being able to move that forward. However, pandemic hit. That's been a challenge for anybody to kind of advance that work. So we did have a short kind of reconvening of the overall subcommittee briefly last week, in which we identified, given the challenges people are having in working collaboratively over Zoom and so forth, to actually draft a revision to the policy, we had made the decision to pursue the opportunity to find some support in the drafting of that policy through an intern that's kind of housed with one of our community-based partners that has some capacity to be able to help us produce a draft for the subcommittee's consideration. So the proposal is, in terms of next steps, is to be able to leverage, and that person is based at Pine Tree Legal, and is doing work around, who's one of the community partners connected to the overall kind of sexual harassment and assault working group that's been in existence prior to our taking up that issue. These were members of that group who came and addressed the board back in the fall last year. And so that has some capacity to be able to support just the technical work of, helping us to produce a draft for consideration first at the subcommittee, and then ultimately at the full Policy Committee so that we're able to advance that when we return in August. The subcommittee has agreed to maintain meetings on its monthly cadence. So the goal of being able to review a draft around that from the subcommittee, sexual harassment subcommittee, doing work on that in July and then early August, so that it's positioned to come to the full, formally to the policy committee for review before going to the full policy. And I know that, a number of you have been engaged in the subcommittee, so that would, the opportunity for that would continue. But we think this will be a more efficient process to be able to move us forward with that work. So wanted to update on that. And also recognize part of the impetus of needing to take this up now, in addition to, the real issues that students face, and us wanting to improve our practice on how we both work to prevent these issues and respond when issues of sexual harassment and assault occur, is the, changes in Title IX regulations that will go into effect in August. So the federal DOE came out with revised guidelines around Title IX that kind of all districts need to grapple with in terms of policy implications. So, and while there will be considerable conversation about what those federal recommendations are and potentially, kind of some of the our perspectives on what best practice might be, nevertheless, that's work we need to do to produce a revised policy in accordance with kind of the federal expectations. So the work plan to accomplish that would be to be able to leverage some of this additional capacity to have a draft based, again, on some of the models we had been looking at previously from Ashland, Oregon, the Oakland policy. Those have been two of our kind of cornerstone ones, and actually a higher ed one from Bates has been another policy that's been part of the mix of examples of strong policies in this area. So it would give us the opportunity to, advance that a little more rapidly and have, I think, a structure that works more effectively for the group as opposed to, 7 to 8 people trying to collaboratively write the document, positioning those folks as, with their subject matter expertise, as being able to give feedback on drafts of a document. So we wanted to highlight that for the group, knowing the commitment we'd made to that work previously before the pandemic. In addition, with the federal change and guidance, the need to take that up, and the need for all districts to kind of be taking that up and revising policies, that's something we would need to advance over the summer to be prepared for those expectations in the fall. Ms. Moriani? Sorry.
Hi. I just want to say thank you so much to all the participants of this this sexual harassment subcommittee work. This is actually a fabulous model in my mind of how you bring in a large group of partners, community partners, students, staff. It's been remarkable to watch. I haven't been involved in the meetings, but I have been watching it and keeping updated with it. I just want to say thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing the result of the policy coming forward to us. But I really want to say, I think this is, although it's taken a while, I think this is going to be extremely meaningful and helpful to students who have needed this for a long time. So I appreciate this work very much.
I agree, and just want to thank Mr. Townsend, and also, I agree with Ms. Morioni that it's just a testament to the expertise, knowledge, and commitment in our community, and to be able to engage the community in this way, I think is incredibly valuable. I feel pretty confident that we're going to end up with a policy that serves our students well. And that's not an easy place to get to. So thank you, Mr. Townsend, for leading this work, and for it's a harder way forward than just writing the policy ourselves. I think it's a much better process, and we'll have a better outcome. So thank you for leading this work.
And maybe I might say just, recognizing we had a number of folks in attendance in the public that maybe, we're tuning in for other, our prior issue that may not be as familiar, but just would want to give a shout out to the folks who have been a part of that work, thus far. So that, or just organizationally, who we're talking about, just so that there's awareness and kind of visibility about who are the people that are contributing to that, because I would totally concur, their really expertise is bringing to that. So we have had the partnership of the organization Through These Doors that has been doing work, in collaboration with the schools for some time. So Through These Doors, Speak About It is another organization. Students Speak Up is a small organization that is reflective of one of our graduates and her work that she did as part of her capstone, or their work that they did as part of their capstone, and has transitioned into advocacy work around this issue. We have a partner from USM who is a faculty member in women's and gender studies that has been an important contributor. As well, let me go down the list. The organization Safe Bay, that's a national organization around, consent education and consent work. SARS, which is one of the really important local support groups for responding when there are issues that come up. A representative from Planned Parenthood of New England has been a part of the group, and then two others. Lastly, I mentioned Pine Tree Legal, and then lastly, Boys to Men, which is an organization that does programming around Southern Maine and beyond for students around these issues and topics. So it has been a great group, and also members of the internal district staff, board members. We had a representative from PEA that was part of the group as well. So it's been a strong group.
It's just so it's incredible, right? That we have those resources.
Yeah.
So anything else from the board on this? Okay, terrific. I think we can move on to our last agenda item.
Unmute here for a moment. So our last agenda item is just, this one is a little bit more technical, no pun intended, but is around our technology use. So policy IJNDB, the student computer and internet use. Which is, we obviously, everybody's very familiar with our rapid transition to remote learning. We have been, deploying devices to students in elementary school. And that's not covered in the policy. So we've recognized there are some amendments to the policy that remote learning and the potential of future remote learning, are going to require. And so we intend to kind of do some of that work. We're not proposing as robust of a engagement process per se, just from a capacity and bandwidth perspective, but working with our internal IT folks, as well as, that we've had a couple teacher leaders actually reach out who have done some work around this. So leveraging a few of those folks to propose some revisions to consider the implications for elementary school students under the terms of this, given that we've been in a position of deploying devices to them, and that's not spoken to in our policy at this point. So the intention is to do some work to, consider that and bring that forward for the committee's consideration in the fall in advance of the school year, so that we're prepared for whichever scenario we face, whether that's more remote learning, some hybrid version of that, or ongoing work, but returning to full capacity, but maybe in a context where we've learned some things and we'll continue to try to leverage technology for students in elementary school in ways that hadn't been spoken to previously. So that's just informational a little bit, that we want to advance that and bring that forward, given the current pandemic context and the uncertainty about the fall.
Great, thank you. Are there any board questions about that work? Okay. Anything else that we, Ms. Morion?
Thank you. I had written an email to both you, Chair, and to Aaron about this. And I'm just going to say it because I hadn't received a response. I know we've been super busy with lots of things, so I don't fault either of you at all. And it may not be right now that we actually can't right now because we've got a lot of policies we've already listed out that we're working on. But I really want to request that we take a look at our commercialization policy. And I talked with Chair Rodriguez about, for me, I've actually brought it up quite a few years in a row around looking at opportunities for revenue, increasing our revenue by working with business partners in the community and as well as larger partners, and it could potentially be a resource for our co-curricular activities possibly, or helping to sponsor certain things if we have brought in outside funding. And I know we have our education foundation, but this would be taking a look again at our commercialization policy. So I just would like to request that to be considered for possibly the fall. But thank you.
We also had one other policy that I just want to kind of maybe re-up for us to have on our radar screen in addition to everything else, leading with, I think we need to lead absolutely with the equity policies in addition to what we've talked about tonight. But we did talk about moving up our public comment period in our meetings so that the public isn't having to wait to the very end of our meetings, which can be, 10, 11 o'clock, even midnight, in order to come and address the board. So I would, just as we're thinking about our work after the summer, I would definitely want to make sure that that is on our agenda. I think it would be a very important change in order to ensure that the public can participate, especially members of the public that, or I would say, in particular, when you think about many of the parents who have young kids and for whom it's harder or impossible to stay to 9, 10, 11 o'clock or midnight to participate. So just want to re-up that as we're getting back to the work of this committee. Okay, and I see the chair has his hand up. Mr. Rodriguez.
I was debating in my head whether even to say this because I didn't want to get too into the topic, but that whole policy is going to be under review. We also wanted to consider moving the personnel item reports earlier, also just in consideration of our staff who have to stay to the end just to read something that's just kind of like an action that doesn't usually require much conversation. And also just want to kind of plant a seed or rather plant a flag on this conversation that given what we've experienced as far as public engagement through these virtual meetings, perhaps we also need to take a look at our public comment policy and figure out if we do need to have some sort of stated rules that govern how the virtual public comment is done. We're following some language that's specific to Zoom, how Zoom operates, right? Like the raise your hand and stuff. But perhaps there's some other areas of virtual meeting that need to be looked at through a policy lens, and maybe Drummond Woodson would help us with that in case there's some legal considerations that we should have in mind. But I just wanted to drop that in there. But again, that's sort of kind of segueing away from what we're really mean to say tonight. But thank you. Appreciate the time to say that though.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. And I see that Michael has his hand up as a attendee. And Michael, we don't have public comment tonight, but if you are interested in talking about the issue of SROs, we discussed tonight, I'm not sure if you were on the whole meeting, but we discussed tonight that it will be on our agenda at our full board meeting next Tuesday evening. All right, so is there a motion to adjourn? Okay, Mr. Atkinson, seconded by Ms. Morioni. All in favor of adjourning? I see all three hands of the committee members. That is it for tonight. Thank you for all the members of the public who joined us. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your participation and your continued involvement will be essential as we take on these critical issues. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.